So yesterday we were talking about how they work as a linkage institution, right? So the ways that parties help tie us as voters and citizens to our federal government, translate information for us, transmit information for us, right? Give us cues, help us understand what they're trying to do, explain processes to us, right? Coordinate between what we want and how they get things done. So the political parties are incredibly important as a representative of democracy, ensuring that what we want translates into action at the federal level. So that's where we were yesterday. So I'm going to stop a little bit on that and talk about organization of political parties in general. There's a couple different ways to look at how political parties operate and how they organize. And so we're going to talk about the different elements of a political party real quick. And in doing so, we're also going to describe the internal organization that we see within the political party. Now, the one thing you have to remember is that this is very much a generalized description because each state can organize their party, and each party in each state can organize their party and structure the way they want to. We're going to talk about three ways of looking at the political party, parts of it, and organizing it. The party in the electorate, the party in the organization, the party in government. This first one, the party in the electorate, is really interesting in a sense because in a state, especially like Texas, where you don't actually do anything to join a political party, the electorate, the party in the electorate is simply a reference to what you believe you are, right? So in Texas, all it takes to become a member of the Republican Party or a member of the Democratic Party or whatever other party is for you to believe that that's the party that's representing you and that you are, right, identifying with that party. There's nothing official, nothing on paper. You don't say I'm a member, right? I assert or I have to fill out this affidavit saying I'm a member of this party. Membership in Texas of the political party is just a psychological identification that occurs in your head, right? That's not true in all states, right? Some states, when you fill out your voter registration card, you will indicate on that voter registration card what party you identify with. And there's consequences to that in the sense that when you show up to vote at a primary, they've got what you put on your voter registration card for your party membership, and that's the ballot you get in a primary. Whereas in Texas, since we don't do that when we register to vote, we just register. When we show up at a primary, they say, what party's ballot would you like to vote on? And you get to make up your mind at the primary. So the question here is, how do you join a party? And the right answer that's true across the board is that it's something that you choose for yourself. So you join the party by identifying and assuming, saying you're a member of the party. In some states, there are extra steps, but that step is required, right? You have to make that decision. In other states, you may have to sign some paperwork or something. But so this one element of how we identify what part of the political party is simply that group of people that identify with that party. That's the party in the electorate. The electorate are those folks who vote, right? That are so anybody that's voting or says they're going to vote and says they belong to a particular party, they do, right? And so it's real hard, especially in states like Texas, to know how big that is or how much that is, right? We ask, we do polling, people tell us, we do inferences from that to expand that out to the statewide, and you know we're close in knowing what that is, but that's just a snapshot, as all polling. That's just a snapshot in time, right? It's a picture right then, right there. And there's nothing that stops somebody from being a Democrat today and a Republican tomorrow and a Libertarian the next day. But the three parts of the political party that we identify and talk about, one part of it is the group of people that identify with the party, and we call that the party and the electorate. The second part that we can talk about is the party and the organization. So this is kind of the leadership hierarchy and structure of a political party. This is where you can go to a political party's website and see who holds offices within the party, where offices are physically located, right? Phone numbers that you can call and expect people to answer and say, this is so-and-so from this particular party, right? So, whereas the party and the electorate is kind of this ephemeral action of identification, the party and the organization is those folks that are not only saying they belong to the party, but are working, right, on a routine basis for the political party. Some of that in a permanent kind of job orientation, and some of it in a volunteer orientation. So when we look at this way of identifying the political party at the organization, we're looking at, right, positions that are filled by people within the organization and they're doing work for it. So there's two parts of the organization. There's the temporary and the permanent part of the organization. And the temporary is pretty easy to understand, right? These are all of the volunteers that when the party, whichever party it is, needs help, they say, hey, we need help. And these people, right, they volunteer and they come in and they work. And that's temporary because they're doing it for just a short period of time on a volunteer basis and they're back to their own lives, right? And so this is mainly during campaigns and election seasons that you see the temporary part of the party being busy, right now, right in this run up to the election. The permanent part of the organization are those people who hold positions within the party that they're either elected or appointed to. There's, the secretaries within the party, the chairpersons, the committee members within the party that are responsible for developing policy or perspective or something for the party as a whole. These are people that, right, have a title usually that goes with their job, right? So you could be the state chairperson for the Texas Republican Party, right? Well, your job is to lead the party on a day-to-day basis, making sure that the bills are paid and that the offices are open and that you have staff working, right? I mean, and so you're working in a position for the political party. And these will go all the way down from state level to state districts to county level and precincts within the counties, right? Each county has 4 precincts, so there's going to be 4 precinct offices in Travis or Williamson County for the Democratic Party, and probably the same for the Republican Party. If they don't have precinct offices, they'll have the county office, and then within that county office, they'll have precinct focused activities and business and stuff. So these are folks that a lot of them are retired and they may not even get paid, but they show up and they have a ongoing working relationship in a permanent kind of structure, right, where you're filling seats and you're filling positions. Does that make sense? The distinction between permanent and temporary. Let's see if I can find a diagram real quick. And let's kick over this. So this is right, kind of how you see this set up, right? So this, I'm sorry, let me go over here and get this orange, right, section over here would be your permanent party organization. These folks over here are ensuring that these conventions over here happen. They're ensuring that these offices over here are staffed and that there are people working at them. And the temporary part is going to be these people down here. They're usually just voters and sometimes are volunteers that help in these areas. Right, so that's what we're talking about. So you've got state chairs and vice chairs and executive committee members. And I thought the question is, how are they elected? And sometimes, they're elected within the party. So, and some of them are selected and appointed, right, within the party. So, a lot of times you've got a lot of folks that aren't working, aren't helping, and so they'll take any warm body that walks through the door. And so at the lower levels, if you want to work at the precinct, you basically show up and they'll find something for you to do. Now you're not going to get paid. Right? They'll put you at a desk or something and say, here, make some phone calls, or here, fill these envelopes and get them mailed or whatever. But these folks up at the higher levels, right, the precinct chairs and county chairpersons, they are going to be selected and they're going to fill these positions on a routine basis. So it's an odd mix of volunteerism and some work-oriented. Well, they don't really, and they don't really need to, in a sense, right? Because fraudulent people that show up and volunteer they're still going to be expected to do stuff, right? And so even if you don't believe and you don't like the party, if your job is to sit there and stuff envelopes, right? I guess you could maybe send out some blank envelopes, but really it's not going to be very productive as a way of undermining the party that you've walked into their office to work with, right? You're going to be working with people as a group. People are going to be overseeing you. So you're really not going to probably be able to submarine much of what's going on there, right? And frankly, the impact that you would have trying to do that would be pretty small. And you probably wouldn't think it's worth your time. You'd probably be more effective going and working for the side you actually believe in, right? And trying to make a positive impact instead of trying to undermine. And we can we know, right, that they don't ever get enough people to do their work, right? They've got more work than they can usually handle. So there's not just a whole lot of people lining up volunteering. They're always looking for help. So it's an interesting kind of way of going about this. Very much, just people wanting to make a positive difference and getting involved to do that. And the more involved you get, the more opportunity you're going to have over time to move into a position of consequence where you can make a difference. But by that time, right, you're obviously there because you believe in it, right? So the thing to keep in mind is the temporary part are those folks that show up and volunteer for a bit of time, 2 months here, a month here, something like that, to get through an election period or a primary period. And then, they're just helping out. They believe in the cause, they believe in the party, and they're volunteering some of their time. And they're temporary. The permanent, right, are going to be doing this as filling official positions. Their job will be with the party. They'll be recognized as leaders within the political party in their district or their county or something. And they're true believers in the sense that this party is really important to them, and they're going to try and ensure that they can do everything they can to get members of the party elected to office, right? So that they can control government. And they're going to work on this, right, as a real position, a real job. So the third part that we can identify when we're looking at these pieces or parts of a political party is what we call the party and government. This one is really easy to understand. If you are elected or appointed to an official public office in government, then you are in the party in government. So, you look at Governor Abbott, right? He's a Republican in Texas. Well, as the governor, right, elected to the office of governor in Texas, he's part of the Republican Party in government. If you were to identify a Democrat that's elected to government, they were part of the Democratic Party in government. If you were appointed to a judgeship, or you would be whatever party you belong to in their party in government. So these are identifiable party members, right, that have achieved an office in government, either through election or appointment. And so they're working in government, doing whatever their job in government is, having gotten there as being an elected or appointed member from their party. So all the politicians, right, are this party in government. Now, the other thing you need to understand is that these three parts, party in the electorate, party organization, party in the government, they are not separate and distinct from one another. Okay? So consider President Trump. He's in the party in government, right? He is the Republican president. He's been elected to that position. So he's in the party in government. Is he in the party of the organization? Yes, in a non-official capacity, right? He leads the Republican Party policy-wise. He generates a lot of money, donations for the National Republican Party. He supports, state and local elections for Republican Party members. So he's in the party in the organization. Is he in the party in the electorate? Well, he identified himself as a Republican and ran for president under that name, so under that party moniker. So yeah, he's that too, right? So if you look at Governor Abbott, right, elected to office as a Republican, leads the Republican Party in Texas, obviously identifies personally as a Republican. So you can be all of these, right? All three of these at one time. If you're in government or in the organization, you're almost always going to be in the electorate as well. So that's three ways that we can identify people within parties as to what part of the party they belong to. Then there's that structure that I showed you within the states and then at the national level as well, right, where there's an organization there, like a business or a company organization as well, where people are filling in spots and have positions. Does that make sense? So let's talk about where the parties have a really big impact in the election process. Now, it's obvious that we're looking at the national elections and we see everything being lined up as Democrat or Republican, and we know that the parties have some impact, have a lot of impact there because we've got people running for office from those parties. But the first place you see this is at the primaries, right, at the state level, or the caucuses at the state level. Because these parts, through the primaries and caucuses, are actually driven by the parties, right? There is you look to Texas, there's a Republican Party primary. There's a Democratic Party primary. Those primaries that are happening in Texas are focused at the party, right? And so when you participate as a voter in a primary, say you show up at Texas at the polls and you say, I want to vote, ask you which primary you want to vote in, and you tell them I want to vote in the Democratic Party primary. They hand you a ballot, and on that ballot are only members of the Democratic Party that are trying to get elected eventually to office. What they're doing in that primary is trying to win the party's nomination for that office so that they will be the only person supported by the party running for that office in the general election. And these primaries that we have, and we have primaries in almost all the states. We have a couple states that do caucuses, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But the primaries, right, are physically like the election, the general election, right, that we just went through. You show up at a polling place, you tell them what party you want to vote for, they put that ballot in your voting machine for you, and you vote for members of that one party that you selected to represent that party. The states go about it a little differently, right? Remember, all 50 states get to define how they do this process, and so the primaries in Texas are different than the primaries in Louisiana, that are different than the primaries in, say, Arkansas. Depending upon the state you are in, you will get a different flavor of a primary. In Texas, we have what are called, generally referred to as open primaries. And so open primaries are like I've described. You as a voter show up at the poll. The people that are working that polling place ask you what primary you want to vote in. And so you choose on that primary election day what primary you want to vote in. That's an open primary where the voter chooses it when they're at the polls. In opposition to that, or conversely to that, is what a lot of states use. It's called a closed primary. And closed primaries only let registered party members vote in the party's primary. So this is where you would, as a voter, at some earlier point in time, have identified yourself as a party member to the government, to the state government. You will have filled out, in most states, you will have filled out your voter registration card, and you will have checked a box on there saying which party you identify with. When you show up to a primary in that state, they're going to look at that card and they're going to say, oh, you checked on here that you're a Republican. Here's your Republican primary ballot. Go vote in the Republican primary. So the choice you made earlier determines what primary you're going to vote in. In Texas, we dispense with it and we have the open primary. You decide when you get there, right? Neither one's necessarily better or worse than the other. It's just different ways of going about it. Texas allows more flexibility, right? But less predictability, right? You go to a state like Arkansas or Missouri or something like that, one of the states that has a closed primary, they know how many people have filled out voter registration cards and identified with each party. They've already printed up ballots, right? They've got, okay, we had 40,000 people in this county say that they're Republicans. So we're going to have 40,000 Republican ballots. And we had 40,000 Democrats. We'll have 40,000, right? They'll know. In Texas, right, they don't know, right? And how many people are registered. So they know how many people could show up, but they don't know which ballot they're going to request until they get there. So you've got, those are the two main ways of approaching organizing and running a primary where you're going to vote for party members. There's always, right, a weird one-off kind of thing, and that's in this case that's Louisiana. They do what's called a blanket primary. And by saying one-off, I'm not trying to make it sound crazy. It's just different, but there's some sense behind it, and it works. So what the blanket primary is that everybody is on the ballot for all of the parties. And so you may have, say you're in Louisiana and you've got primary going on, and there are 6 people that want to be governor for Louisiana. 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, a Libertarian, and a Green. All 6 of them will be on the ballot, for the primary ballot. And then you, as the voter, show up and say, hey, I want to vote in the primary. And they give you a ballot. And you don't have to, there's no I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat or anything. They give you a ballot, everybody's on it, and you go vote for one of those 6. The result of that, most of the time, is that you get some positions where you have nobody getting a majority of the vote in either party or between the parties, and so you have to have runoffs. But sometimes, right, sometimes you'll get one person, say out of those 6, that gets 60% of the vote. Well, if that happens, that person just became governor of Louisiana. Right? There's no reason for them to have a general election come November because they just beat everybody in one time. That doesn't usually happen, but it's possible, right? So what usually happens is you'll get a party member, right? Someone that identifies as a Republican, or 2 or 3 that identify as Republican, and a couple of them will be very close to each other, but neither one will get a majority from their party. Maybe the Democrat gets, there's 2 Democrats running and one of them gets the majority. So they're going to be on the general election as a Democrat. There'll be a runoff between the 2 Republicans to see which of those 1 Republicans ends up on the general election ballot. And then, right, you'll see if you get any other party that gets in there. So it's kind of an interesting approach to looking at it. It doesn't require the members to join a party or identify themselves as a party member. It has the potential of taking care of the whole election during the primaries. It usually doesn't, though, right? It usually generates a situation where you have some runoff elections and then you end up having the general election just like everybody else. Those are the 3 that we see. Now, do those make sense to you? Closed, open, and blanket primaries? All right, so I don't have a slide on the caucus. So the caucus is, in some states hold what is called a caucus instead of a primary. And a caucus, each party organizes their own. and they set a place and time at all the precinct levels, right? Which is in Texas, a precinct has there's 4 precincts in a county, so you're basically breaking a county up into 4 areas that have about the same number of people in them. And each of those precincts will have a caucus, and you will go to your caucus. And it is generally held in a very large auditorium because everybody's going to be there at the same time. And you're all going to vote publicly in this caucus at the same time. People are going to stand up and talk about who you should be voting for and why, and then they're going to take votes. And it's a very old-fashioned, right, historical way of the community coming together and making decisions and voting. And they're going to count all the votes and add them all up, and then they'll just like if it were a primary, except instead of doing it privately, right, you and your little polling machine, right, standing in a room but nobody's talking, it's going to be a much more public process where people participate and talk. So a couple states still use caucuses. Iowa, I think, is one of them. Maine or New Hampshire, there's a few of the older states that still have held on to that, especially smaller states, smaller population states, right? Texas has a caucus process kind of hidden in the backside of it. After the primaries are over in Texas, the states hold caucuses amongst the people that voted in their primary. So in Texas, you go to the primary and you say, I'm going to vote in the Democratic primary. Afterwards, since you have selected the Democratic Party as the primary you wanted to vote in, you are eligible to go to a Democratic Party caucus where they translate all of those votes that were cast in the primary to support for candidates to go up to the county level, the district level, the state level, and they pick delegates to do that work behind the scenes. Now, so your votes are all counting just like you cast them, but they also use the caucus in the background to organize and populate their district conventions and state conventions, right, and send delegates to those to represent what people in that party in that precinct or county or district wanted. Because the caucus is not just going to be about selecting members for office, it's also going to be about organizing that political party for the next 4 years. Because you got to remember that a political party has a political platform, right? And as a group, that party has to tease out what it is to be a Democrat in Texas or a Republican in Texas. And then eventually we need to tease out, say, if you're a Democrat, what it means to be Democrat at the national level. What do all the Democrats from all of the states agree upon, and what's going to be the national party platform for those Democrats? Well, the delegates are going to work all that out, representing the states and representing the voters behind the scenes as they move up in these conventions. So you've got a couple processes going on at the same time. You've got the primary process where we, the voters, show up and cast our votes. And then behind the scenes, you've got the party working within itself to identify itself in line with the votes that they're seeing and the policies they want to propose as they go forward. Now, those policies are going to be dictated by the success of candidates in the primaries, right? Candidates are going to be running on things and saying, I believe this, and if you elect me, I'll do this. And as a Republican, I'll do this. And then people vote. And so that generates some support for those perspectives. So it's a lot of work. Most of us don't pay attention to all this that's going on behind the scenes. Right? But the political parties are organizing all of this and putting these messages together and putting these policy ideas together and generating a party platform that represents their party and the politics their party wants to support. And we as voters play a part in that, whether we follow up with it or not through the caucus process. Questions? So let's talk about what ought to be going on, what we expect. We've got these parties that are defining themselves and defining the policies that they're going to stand on and run for office on, and what their candidates are going to be, representing to us, the voters. The question we have to ask is, how should they be going about this, right? Most of us don't pay attention to what's going on in the background of the political parties. We see, if we're paying attention, that they come up with a political party platform that describes themselves as a party. Most of us don't read those, but they put them out there. We see what the candidates from a political party tend to stand for, so we get a feeling about what it's all about. But what's the purpose of a political party? What's their goal? Anybody remember from our definition? Right. Political parties' goal is to win elections. Right. That's what they're there for. They're trying to control government by winning the elections of government. Right. And so their main reason for existing is to win elections and get their people in government. But that's their goal, is to win elections. And they're serious about that. If they take that goal to heart, economists, political scientists and economists say, well, if that's how you're going to define success, by winning office, then shouldn't you always define your party by the most popular policies out there? Do you really care what the policies are? A rational party model, right? Remember, rational being cost benefit analysis kind of thing, is you're doing good when you're winning. You're winning when you get elected to office. So the message that you should put out, if we're going to be rational about this, is a message that will win. Is that what we see parties doing? Sometimes they do. Sometimes they hold positions that are a little difficult to defend, but by the time, right, a party's trying to put out there what they think is the message that's going to work for them, getting what they want, and is popular enough to get elected. So a party that wants to win should define itself where the voters are. We're going to be rational about this. We're going to take the winner-take-all approach to this, right? If I'm the Republican Party and I'm wanting to run for office, I should look for the policies that most people support and say, these are the policies of the Republican Party. In other words, I should organize myself, and everybody in my party should organize themselves to be centrist, and to be in the middle, to be pickable by almost any voter, right? If all parties did this, what would those parties look like? They would be very similar, would they not? If the Republican Party was saying here, we should pick policies that are going to appeal to the most people, and if they can do that accurately, right, they'll have a set of policies that appeals to 60 or 70% of the people. And if the Democratic Party had the same perspective, they'd have the same policies probably, right? Because they're competing for the same people. For the longest time in political history in the United States, we have seen, and it's still true to a large extent, that there's not very much difference between what the majority of the Republican Party and the majority of the Democratic Party want and believe. Um, are, are both parties supporters of the Constitution? They think the Constitution is the base document about how our country should work and our government should run? Yes. Do both parties generally believe that law is important and should be followed by citizens and government? Yes. Do both the parties believe that our elections have impact and are a good way to select leaders and in government? Yes. See, you can go down the list, right? And there's not a lot of difference in how they want to do things. The Republican Party supporting capitalism as its primary economic approach to the country. Yes. What about the Democrats? Are they capitalist as well? Yes, they're free market capitalists, right? They may have a bigger role for government in regulation somewhere, but they still think the market is the best way to run things. Right? So generally speaking, Democrats and Republicans agree on these really big, broad ideas about how to run our country and how to get things done. They may disagree on some of the minutia, in a sense, of how we get policy implemented and put into place. But as two successful parties, they've kind of defined themselves pretty close to the center. And if you were to look at the ideological spectrum, and right, you look at the curve, the ideological curve, most of the people in the middle, and the Democrats are on just the left-hand side of the center, and the Republicans are on the right-hand side of the center. Now they've moved back and forth some; they're not static, but you don't generally see, right, our two most successful parties at the furthest ends of the ideological spectrum, right? So the Rational Party says that our parties ought to be paying attention to where most of the policy preferences are among the population. And when we look at our parties, lo and behold, they are generally close to those center elements, right, of the government and of ideology. That makes sense. Let's take a party on, let's say the Green Party, right? The Green Party, environmental party, right, is on the far left-hand side of the spectrum, right? How many people do you think the Green Party generally appeals to in the United States? Well, if we look at this presidential election we're seeing right here, it's 1 or 2% of the people, right, when we see who votes for them. Do they appeal to more than that? Probably, right? Probably a good portion of the people that consider themselves Greens know that as a third party, they're not going to be very competitive and they may not go vote. So we could say that there are more Greens out there than the 1 or 2% we see voting at the national level. But is it more than 5% or 7% of the population? Probably not. Right? What the Green Party stands for and the way they want to generally do government and develop policy, they're kind of a niche political party. They're not in the center. They're not appealing to everybody, right? They don't even appeal, right, to most of the Democrats, which are closer to them than anybody else. So they're not going to be successful getting elected to office in the U.S. because they've defined themselves at the margin of the political ideology. There's not a lot of people who want to vote for them. Now, do they have a articulated policy preference and platform and all that? Yes. Can they make a good argument about what they believe and what they want to see happen? Certainly. Right? They're probably also very much committed to their policies and don't want to vary too much. But that makes them less flexible and less apt to be supported by most of the people voting. So what are the chances of them winning? Not very good. But if they were more negotiable about what they stood for, how they wanted to get it done, they might be more competitive with the Democrats. Right? They'd be closer to the center. But they're not. Right? They're off to the left-hand spectrum. And the rational party model says if you're not close to the center, appealing to the majorities, your chances of getting in office are very, very slim. And that's true. So that's the rational party model. Now, some of the interesting things that we see going on when we look at party politics and how parties play out in the political election season is that a lot of times party results and the competition between political parties gives us some very important indicators about what's going on in our country and our democracy. And we saw some of this, right, playing into this presidential election. We have, if you're paying attention to, right, the pundits as they talk about it, you heard probably some of them talking about the potential for a blue wave, right? And what they were talking about was that there were some indications that there might have been a lot of Democrats that were going to participate that hadn't, progressives that were to the far left that were going to vote Democrat instead of sit out, maybe a good number of independents that didn't consider themselves Democrats but would end up voting Democrat. And all of that, if it came together the right way, would be an overwhelming victory for the Democratic Party in this presidential election. Enough so that the Democrats might share not only the House, not only the presidency, but maybe even the Senate at the federal level. If that had happened, and it didn't, but if that had happened, right, we would be this morning asking ourselves, is this durable? Is this an election result that is a harbinger for elections that are coming? Are we going to see the Democrats be a majority party in the House and the Senate and the presidency for the foreseeable future? In other words, did enough people realign behind the Democrats to cause this blue wave? So if we'd seen it, our first reaction would be, wow, Democrats really put something together and they took over the federal government. The next question is this a one election result or is this a durable election result? If it's durable, if it's going to last 2, 4, 8 years, it might be what we call a party realignment, which is a durable change in the affiliation of voters from one party or no party to another party or to a party. And so if it had happened this time, we'd have seen, as I said, independents and progressives, maybe some Green Party members, and obviously the Democrats all coalesced together behind the Democratic candidates for office, from state office to national office to the presidency. If that had happened, and then 2 years down the road, right, the next House election, midterm election, we saw that same coalition of people vote that again, we go, hey, maybe this wasn't just a one-time deal. Maybe this was a durable change. It'll last. And 2 years further down the road, it's still there. Right? Then we would say, yep, we saw a party realignment in 2020. Right? And we've seen it now in a couple elections since then. So it's been durable. That's a party realignment. And that's an interesting thing to note and to be able to historically look back at. So in 2024 or 2026 or something like that, if this had happened and was continuing to happen, we would look back at the election of 2020 and say, that was a critical election. That was an election that revealed a durable change in party affiliation, a realignment from Republican control of the federal government to Democratic control of the federal government. And in 2018, we were kind of wondering if that was what was starting to take place, right? Because when Trump got elected into office in 2016, right, the Republicans also controlled the House of Representatives and the Senate. So all three parts of government were Republican. Midterm election, the Democrats took over the House, 2018. And from some of the polling results, we were thinking that maybe we would see a completion of that takeover in the House and the presidency in 2020, and that you might see this going on into the future. And if that was the case, it would have been a party realignment, and maybe the 2018 election would have been a critical one, but definitely the 2020 election would have been deemed a critical election because we'd have seen that realignment. We're probably not seeing that, right? We're not going to see the Senate probably move over into the Democratic control. And if it does happen, it'll be by the slimmest of margins. And we'll won't really have thought that this is really a party realignment situation or a critical election. It'll just be more of the same between the parties duking it out, and sometimes one side wins, and sometimes the other side wins, depending upon historical circumstances and candidate appeal and good electioneering by the parties behind the scenes. So that's, one of the things we as political scientists are always looking for, these critical elections which show us or reveal to us a party realignment. And we've seen a few of them historically speaking. When they happen, they're important, and they signify a durable change on who's going to be in charge for a while. What we've been seeing, though, for the last 10 years or so at least, a little longer than that actually, is something we actually refer to as party de-alignment. And this is where voters are having a real hard time finding a party that works for them, that represents them. And if you've been paying attention, you've heard voters talk about, I used to be a moderate Republican. I can't call myself that anymore. I'm still conservative in my beliefs, but my party has moved right of me. They've become more radical, and they've left me here. And I can't call myself a Republican anymore. And I'm not a Democrat, so I'm not aligned with either party. And what we've seen happen over time is a growth in this percentage of people that are calling themselves independents, and that neither party's working for them. We've seen this growth of party de-alignment. I've already started talking about these slides here, right? What a critical election is, right? What a party realignment is, and where I'm trying to get to is here, right? Do we see party de-alignment? And we see, right, upwards to 40% of the voting population describe themselves as independents today. And that's telling us that the parties aren't doing that good a job of identifying where the voters are and getting them on board. We see people that have called themselves Democrats or called themselves Republicans that are not holding those labels anymore, right? They're saying, I'm not either. We have maybe more divided government, which is what we're in right now, right? Where the House is controlled by the Democratic Party and the Senate's controlled by the Republican Party. When you have that, right, it's hard to get things done. And that's kind of a reflection of the voters, right, not being consistent on who they're identifying with, because the parties haven't given them enough to help them solidify behind one side or the other. So we got some charts that show us this as it's been going on, right? How this is actually manifesting itself, and this one is a good one, right? So if you look here, right, what you're looking at is the Senate, U.S. Senate, from 1973, 1974, And the center line here, right, is the middle of the electorate. This is where the center of ideology is. And the blues are where the Democrats are in office that are in the Senate, right? And the reds are where the Republicans are in the Senate. And the overwhelming takeaway from this part right here is this overlap, right? Here's the center, and you've got Republicans on the left of center, and you've got Democrats on the right of center, which tells you that these parties, although there's some differences, there's a lot of overlay. There's a lot that they hold together in common, right? This is 73 and 74. You look down at the House, this distribution chart of the Republicans and Democrats shows a lot of overlap here too, right here in the middle. So the two parties, while there was a difference between them, there was an awful lot of similarity. Jump forward, right, to 93 and 94, 20 years, and look at the shape right here and the shape here. Notice the center is starting to hollow out, right? Democrats have moved a little to the left, but what we see is more Republicans, right, that were way over here, right, left of center. There's only one bar that's showing anybody left of center for the Republicans, and only one bar showing anybody right of center for the Democrats. Now, they only had two over here before, so they only lost one. But I mean, you had 1, 2, 3, and now you're down to one. So you're starting to see the parties split apart in what they stand for and how the voters look at. If you go down into the House, it's even more apparent, right? It's a much cleaner divide starting to happen here. Go forward another 20 years or so. And now look at the Senate. Look at this gap here in the middle. Where's the overlap? It's not really happening. Look down at the House, right? There's actually a visible gap, right, where there's nobody in the Republican Party, just right of center, which is showing you that in the House there's been a marked move, right, really identifiable move of the Republican Party further to the right, away from the center. Democrats have moved too, as you see these lines starting to stack up a little taller away from center, but they do still have people close to the center, right? Some. But they haven't moved as much. The Republicans here, right, you can see that move happening. What that means, what that means is that you're going to have policy being presented by the parties that neither side can see any room for compromise, right? When you've got a big gap like this, where's the common ground? Where's the place where the parties can come together and negotiate and get something done? And if this is happening, if the parties are moving that way, but 40% of our voting population say my parties have left me, that tells you the people are still here, right? They're still in this area in the center, and their parties have radicalized to the sides of them. And those people feel like nobody represents them anymore. And so we can see, right, the moderate part of the two parties shrinking, right? And each party moving a little to the Democrats a little, the Republicans a little more, right, to the ideological extremes on each end of this spectrum. Well, now, if parties are trying to win, they should be looking more like these over here than they should be looking like this, right? That rational party model says you should be close to the center so that you appeal to more people. But we're seeing our parties separate on the ideological spectrum, and we're seeing a large number of people say, either one of these groups are working for me right now. So, what's causing that? How are we seeing that? Why are we seeing that? First off, this is happening at the state level, even more markedly, right? Even more demonstrably at the state level. The parties are becoming more extreme. They're becoming more solidified in their positions, and they're finding themselves opposed to the other party, not necessarily for a particular policy that might overlap, but we're Democrats, we don't believe what they believe, and we're Republicans, we don't believe what Democrats believe. Right? They're defining themselves in opposition to their competition. Throw into that what we've discussed already about media a little bit and the bias that you see in it, right? From how you pick stories and how you deliver stories, right? That is focused on sensationalism and grabbing a market share and protecting a viewership. The media is going to love this more combative line drawing, right, and position taking that goes on political parties. That's more exciting and that's more sensationalistic and that gets more eyes. So the media is going to play that division up, and they're going to play that. They're going to try to rile up folks or get people excited about the combat that's going to occur here. And then the other thing that we have happening at the state level that's driving this is gerrymandering, right? The intentional redrawing of political boundaries to favor one political party over another. And when you draw political boundaries that emphasize and support one political party and ensure that party is going to be successful in elections within that political boundary and drive the other parties out, by the way you draw those boundaries, you're accentuating the differences between the parties. You're tilting the playing field, right, toward one party and away from the other party, which is going to ratchet up the angst and the anger and the combativeness that goes between the parties. So we've got a lot of things here that are driving us away from the center of the political parties, away from the political center, away from the support of the moderates in the middle, toward more radical representation of a political ideology in the extreme and not the center. Is it any wonder that we can't get a government that can work between Democrats and Republicans and find some kind of middle ground that works for the country as a whole? Right? This is making sense how I'm describing this to you? Just track along with the way you kind of see things happening. Right. All right, so I am not going to start showing you the gerrymandering examples with just a couple minutes left, so we'll stop here today. Are there any questions about any of the material I've covered today? If not, we'll start next week on our gerrymandering examples, talk about how that works, and finish off some of the discussion on political parties next week.